hoping to just give you some information, some perspective, some of the things that we've been seeing happening over the past year in particular as you start to plan forward with your own family. So just out of curiosity, show of hands, how many people have first-year students here? First year being freshmen. How about sophomores? And juniors? Anybody have a senior in the family? There are a few that I'm sure do, right? So you're like, I totally get what's happening here right now. Okay, the point of tonight is to really just give you information, like I said. But before I go any further, I want to introduce two really important people in my office so that you are aware of who they are, because honestly, this wouldn't be happening. What we do in our space would not happen without their help. So, Jen Mosier, you want to stand and wave and say hi? Hi, everybody. And Ariel Taylor is not with us, but she is also in our office. So, meet your group of college and career advisors. So, tonight, we're really trying to give some calmness to what's happening. How many of you are here because you're like really worried about this process? There's some students in the crowd for sure. How many have been through this process with a student in their house already? How many years ago? Just like kind of shout out. 2, 3 maybe? Yeah. So I can tell you it's a dramatically different landscape than it was even 2 years ago. So I'm glad that you're here, because what even occurred 2 years ago is very different now, and certainly very different from when we all applied. So even though that was just like a couple of years ago. So I totally encourage questions, but I'm going to hold them to the end if that's okay. So be sure to just raise your hand and ask. I'm planning for us to be here until 8:30. If we end earlier, great. If we go later, I'm fine to stay. I just want you to walk away feeling like you got some information and you kind of know what you need to know going forward. So here we go. All right, so tonight we're going to cover some of the trends. There's been a lot happening with college admissions over the past 2 years, most of it as a result of the pandemic. So we're going to talk about what that looks like and how that has to really change how we look at this process. We're going to dive deep into that. I'm going to give you some takeaways, because I'm a really big believer. If I give you information, I want you to have some steps and like some plans in place to help get through this. And then we're going to talk about what it really means to be an authentic applicant, because that word authenticity is becoming ever more important as we go through this process. All right, so I'm going to start with this because I'm sure a lot of people are out there thinking like nobody's gotten into college. If you have a current senior, there's a bunch of stress over it. What I'm here to tell you is Miramani has done fantastic in this application year, and I say that in a really big way. That's unexpected, but we worked really hard with them. And so, I know you can't see this very well, but we did an initiative this year where we had, as the seniors were finding out where they got into college, we had them come into our office, write down the college, ring a bell, take candy. By the way, we're taking candy donations if anybody wants to donate, because we go through it quite quickly. And this is just a snapshot of the colleges they've gotten into. TCU, Yale, Stanford, Boston University, Boston College, University of Oregon, DVC, like all over the map. So what I can tell you with complete certainty is our students did a really fantastic job. The UCs, they've done a fantastic job. We had 21 students get into UCLA this year, which was up from 14 last year. So regardless of what you're hearing out there, that is not true for Miramani. So we're really proud of all the work that they put in. And this little quote, has anybody read The Truth About College Admissions? It came out about 1.5 years ago, Jeff Salengo. So he says that there were 75% of schools using the Common App accept more than half of their applicants. And I kind of want you to hold on to that a little bit, because as we go through and we talk about some of these shifts, it's important to remember there really is a good story here. And so I want you to hold on to that story. It's really easy to like feel the negativity or the fear that comes with this, because it's a fear-based industry, right? When you stop to think about it, all of these things that we pay for additional, the summer programs, the standardized test prep, we do it because we're afraid if we don't, that's gonna mean something bad for our child. So we're trying to take that fear out of this and really try and return to the narrative of this can be fun, and if done well, and if done with intention, it really does have an impact in a very positive way. that we've seen, and for the most part, these have happened over the past 2 years, but there's a big emphasis on this past year. So for the class of 2022, we saw a lot of this occurring. Applications and applicants are increasing. That's going to probably continue to happen. More students are applying in the early decision and early action rounds. I'll talk a little bit more about what that means. For all of you that are taking pictures, I will be sharing out all the slides, so if I move too fast, don't feel like you're going to miss it. I'm also attempting to record this back there. I didn't advertise that out because this is our first time doing it. I don't know how it's going to work, but hopefully you'll have all the information you need. Of course, feel free to take pictures, but just so you know, you don't have to. There is an extended application cycle, so where it used to maybe start in August and end in May, that is not the case any longer. There's a lot of alternate first-year options, so when applicants are accepted, it doesn't look the same as like, I'm going to start in August in the year that I applied and be done. Institutional priorities are taking precedence. We'll talk about what institutional priorities really are. We'll go into the demonstrated interest and the role it plays in college admissions, and that also is on the uptick and what that really looks like. And then we'll talk about standardized testing because it's continuing to shift, and everybody's still asking, should my child be taking a standardized test? And by standardized test, I mean the SAT or the ACT. We're not talking about AP tests in any way. This idea of fit to major and how students are starting to show in their extracurriculars how their interests are going towards a particular major, how that story is being told, and then the shift in competitive majors. So most of us know that like computer science is something that's always been competitive, but there's a big uptick in some of the other areas that we'll talk about tonight. Okay, so applying to more colleges. If you apply to more colleges and more people apply to more colleges, it makes it more competitive, right? So applications have increased over the past 2 years by 6% to about roughly 5.62 applications. That's according to the Common App. There are definitely other applications that happen. So for our students, the UC application is one, the Cal State application is another. Some of our students are filling out the Coalition application, which may or may not be going away. And because of that, the acceptance rates are going down. Now, popular colleges, right? So what does that really mean? So that's roughly the top 100 colleges that most people apply to across the country, across the world, not necessarily at Miramani, but as you can imagine, our Miramani students are very much involved in applying to those colleges. So those acceptance rates are going down. There's a 25% increase in applications at colleges in high demand, right? These highly selected schools, we know them. Duke, University of Virginia, Stanford, the Ivies, all of those colleges that our students tend to apply to, they are not the only colleges out there, right? But in our school, that's a big push for students as they're building their list. They're the ones that they've heard of, they're the ones their parents might have attended. We live in an area where Stanford and Berkeley are basically in our back door, so they see it all the time as well. Something that's really interesting is because of all of that, there's a trickle-down effect. So the less selective colleges, the ones that were really easy to get into, so I'll think of TCU. So when Shannon's daughter applied to TCU 8 years ago, they basically begged her to apply. She was a really strong student. You can't get into TCU, barely anymore, unless you apply as an early decision, early action applicant. So those types of things, so there's a trickle-down effect. So one of the things that we're gonna challenge students with going forward is, oh, and there's Ariel Taylor, right here. And so one of the things we're going to challenge students to look at is just because you don't know the name of that college doesn't mean it's not the next TCU. It doesn't mean that it's not the next Tulane as well, right? So there are colleges that are going to continue to become more competitive, even though at the moment they might be less selective. Interesting fact, so Texas rose 41% in their applications and South Carolina rose 61%. And you're probably thinking like, why are you telling me that? The reason I'm telling you that is because a lot of our students tend to apply to the public colleges in both of those states. So if applications are increasing in those states, that makes it more competitive for our students to get in. The majority of our applicants are applying to the public colleges, so Clemson, University of South Carolina, Texas A&M, like they're applying to those colleges, which is always gonna lean towards their in-state residents. So I kind of put that up there just as an idea, and that's facts as of this year. So just something to really pay attention to, that as public colleges in their own state increase, that's gonna have an impact on our students as well. I know this slide's a little blurry, I tried to get it to not be. These are Common App trends in the past, since 2019, 2020, so over the past 2 years. So what you can see is there was a 14.4% increase in first-year applicants, like the number of people, and then there was a 21.3% increase in the number of applications. So both applicants are applying, and they're applying to more schools. So something, again, to just pay attention to. I do not think it's necessary to apply to a ton more schools. I don't think it really increases your chances. We'll talk about that a little bit in a minute, too. All right, trends, because I think trends are interesting. These are the trends over the past year. So the class of 2020, class of 21, and what we know so far about the class of 2022. The class of 2022 data is still very much trickling in. A lot of colleges do not release that data right away. The UCs won't even release their full data until the fall because they trickle into their students who are waitlisted. So, so just know that we don't have it all yet, but this is what we know for sure. One of the biggest differences is Northeastern. So if you look at Northeastern, 2 years ago, it was a 19% acceptance rate. This year, it was a 7% acceptance rate. Is that shocking for people? It was shocking for me too. And I do this for a living. So one of the reasons is, I'm actually not a big fan of Northeastern right now because I think that they have an application where they don't require supplemental essays. So they had 90,000 applicants this year, which is like unheard of, right? I mean, our UCs don't all get 90,000 applicants. And so what happened was they did a lot of deferring from their early rounds. So they said to their students, okay, we're not gonna reject you, but we're gonna push you into our regular decision round. And then what happened is they didn't let those kids in either, and they ended up waitlisting them. So Northeastern's waitlist right now is extremely long. I mean, I haven't spoken to them, I don't know exactly, but just knowing our students and some of the webinars that I've been on with independent counselors and listening to that information, it's extremely long. So we have to kind of break it down a little bit. So Northeastern is becoming a school where 2 years ago might have landed on our kids' like target or maybe likely list. It is no longer. The sheer fact that it's at 7% puts it on a dream list for every applicant. So just as a really good example of what's happening. But you can see the rest of them are kind of trending downwards as well. And by the way, I didn't put those on there for any reason other than that's the information I have all 3 years. That's the truth. So what's the takeaway from this? So what does that mean for your kids? That means it's important to create a well-balanced list. I'm gonna get a little bit on a soapbox on this one. A lot of us hire independent counselors, and I completely understand why, and I completely support that. Here's what you need to understand though. When college counselors are building a list for their students, they are building it based on what they think they understand about the process. It's not always accurate. The piece of information that they don't have is how Miramani students do every year, and that becomes a really important factor. We work hard in our office to build relationships with these admissions officers, and so we're really tuned in to what is happening at their campuses as well as what's happening with our Miramani students on those campuses. So the importance of a well-balanced list is critical. It sets the playing field, right? It creates expectations. This year in the class of 22, we saw many kids who came in who don't understand why they didn't get into any of their target schools. And I said, well, Williams is not a target school for anybody, and Dartmouth is not a target school for anybody. So what we saw in really big droves is that their lists were completely unbalanced in the way that they needed to be. So parents, kids thought their list was balanced because they applied to 2 to 3 likelies and 4 to 5 targets. The problem was the schools were not balanced on that list, if that makes sense. So really pay attention to it. And because of that, we started an initiative this year in our office where all the juniors that we met with, they had the option to come meet with us. We built a college list for all of them. We built, I think, 192 college lists, which were not small. They had anywhere from 15 to 25 colleges on them. It was a huge undertaking. We put a lot of time and effort into it, but the main reason we did it was so that students understood in clarity what it looked like for them, what the colleges really should be categorized as. And at this moment, to be quite honest, I'm not even sure that, I don't use the word safety, we don't like safety in our office because it implies that you're going to definitely get in, but I'm not even really sure where likely schools fall right now. So that's a part of what we're going to be reevaluating in our space so that we can guide, particularly the juniors who are coming forward next year, to guide them through this. But trust me, we've got our finger on the pulse. We will figure out what we're doing. So colleges with a less than 20% acceptance rate, hear me on this one, less than 20% acceptance rate is a reach school for everybody. I don't care if you have a 4.75. I don't care if you cured cancer, because the person applying next to you cured cancer and solved Parkinson's. Right? The reality is, if it has a 20% acceptance rate, it is a reach school. If it has a 10% or lower acceptance rate, it is a dream school, a lottery school. Like that new term's kind of upticking too, right? So similar to the lottery, the more tickets you buy, you think you're gonna win, but the more like no's you're gonna get, right? So if it is a 10% chance, then by all means, it's kind of lucky, right? Everybody that's applying to that school, the majority of the people applying to that school are more than qualified to be part of that. So it is a lottery system, and I don't want you applying to many of them. So how do you kind of overcome and decide what colleges that should be on that list? Research. Research, research, research. That does not mean spending 5 minutes on a college website and looking at their mission statement and their pretty trees that they have on campus. It actually means going into their majors, looking at their classes, understanding what their study abroad programs might be, maybe taking a look at like how many AP credits they might accept in the future, having conversations with Miramonte students who are currently on those campuses, having conversations with us, attending rep visits. There's a lot that goes into it. And if you have the opportunity to go and actually visit those campuses, that's great too. Not totally required in the researching part of it, but certainly a helpful tool if you can do that. All right, we talked a little bit about more students applying early decision and early action. This is always a hard conversation because early decision is a binding decision. So if you are applying in an early decision round, and by the way, not all colleges have early decision and early action, but for those who do, in an early decision round, you are signing a contract with that school that if you get in, you will be going to that school, right? So you're signing it as a parent, your child is signing it as an applicant, and the counselor at our school, their academic counselor, will be signing it as well. And what you are agreeing to is those very terms. So that means that if you happen to get into that early decision school, you must pull all of your applications from every other school. Sometimes colleges don't make that easy. It's not always transparent on their website. In that case, you email the school. What we saw happening, and what is currently happening right now with some of our 2022 graduates, is their applications didn't get pulled for whatever reason, like no blame anywhere. But now they're really stuck because they suddenly got into a school they thought they were never going to get into, but they already committed ED to another school. And so there's a lot of conversation happening around what that means. I will tell you clearly, in our office, we do not support the breaking of an ED contract. So just so you know, if you ever come to us and you want that decision, we're going to be like, we will not have that conversation with you. Unless there is an extreme financial situation, and that does happen, then we can talk. But if it is purely because you suddenly got into your dream school and you were trying to hedge your bets and apply early decision because the acceptance rates there are a little bit higher, I don't want to have that conversation. So just know if you apply early decision what you're getting into. It's not always an easy conversation or a decision to make, but that's what it means. So students do it because it reduces it increases their likelihood of getting in, right? But because more students are doing it and colleges are starting to fill, it's a sure thing, right? Like colleges are a business. They protect their yields. They want to know for sure if I put an offer out, that person's gonna come. And in an early decision round, they know that is the case. So they were starting to now accept more students in their early decision rounds. In my next slide, we'll talk about that in a second. So Boston University fills 50% of its class in early decision compared to 13% 10 years ago. It's a huge step, right? Now, early decision also means you have to be able to afford to pay for that college because you don't know if you have financial aid or not when you actually apply. University of Pittsburgh, this is like hot off the presses. We just hosted a lunch with about 20 college admissions reps about a week and a half, well, right before break. University of Pittsburgh is a rolling admission school, so what that means is if you apply within like 4 to 6 weeks, you find out whether you got in. They started waitlisting students this year in November. It's never happened before, right? Baylor actually said they have an early decision and an early action round. They're like, apply by November 1st, which is their early decision, early action round deadline, because we are going to start to fill up the classes, and it's going to be way more competitive in that regular decision round. And then University of Utah actually stopped reading applications for 5 weeks this year because they had filled so much of their class in early action that they had to regroup as an admissions committee to figure out what they were going to do. So my takeaway from all of this is, I'll go through this for a second. No, go ahead. So this is for the class of 2022, like what has happened so far. So Barnard filled 62% of its class, Penn filled 51%, Tufts 37%. Again, I'll be sending this to you so you'll have all of that, but just really more indication that if you can apply early, it's a good idea. If you know for sure, that is your top school without a doubt. I had 2 kids who've been through this process. One did not apply early, he did not want to lock himself in. The other did because he knew for sure. It's great either way. It just means the process might go on a little bit longer, or maybe not, you might get deferred. But just know that you have to really know what you want to do when you're applying in that early decision. So what does that mean for everybody? When possible, apply by November 1st. The early action deadline is usually November 1st as well, and it's not binding. So you can apply to an early action school, you can apply to every other school that you want, you can wait until March to find out your decisions. You don't have to commit anywhere. It's just the early decision one. So in instances where you can apply early without being bound, go ahead and do that. We encourage that. It actually works well for us too, because in our office, then by the time we go on Thanksgiving break, everybody's kind of done, and we get back in December and it's a little bit quieter, so it helps us out. In rolling decisions, so in those rolling decision rounds, if you can apply by October 15th, that's a really good target. It does not have to be by October 15th, but just something to look forward to. And then just know that when you're applying in an early round, early decision or early action, you're showing interest. So that's just another one of those tick boxes that you've made as an applicant to say, I am really interested in this school. I put forth the extra effort to be able to be here and to be considered. And then use that ED decision wisely. So what often happens is students apply ED because they think that that's going to be their best chance to get into a school. So they tend to use it for like IVs, for Duke, for MIT, for Stanford, who doesn't have technically an early decision, but they restrict you. And so if that's a school that you maybe have like a 2% chance of getting into, applying early is probably only bumping you up to 3%. It's not making that much of a difference, right? So when we say use your ED wisely, think about the schools that are actually reachable, right? Those reach schools, you actually have a decent shot of getting into in that early round. Now that's not to say that we discourage students from applying like to the Ivies or anything else. It just means don't use that in the long hope that I might actually get in, because the chances are you're not, and then you're going to be stuck with a non-ED option, right? And it gets there's another round of ED, but we don't need to talk about it this year. But just think about ED and how you want to use it. Okay, this whole idea of an extended cycle. So what that really means is, I mentioned it earlier, so applications typically start to be filled out. You can start filling out your application, honestly, as soon as like June 1. August 1 is when, June 1 is when the Common App opens, but August 1 is when you can start to like turn applications in. So what happens is students typically applied in the fall, they found out in March, they made a decision by May 1, they deposited it at the school, and then they were off to the races, right? Enjoying the rest of their senior year, having a great summer, making you crazy, because you're like, can you just leave already? I just need you to get out, you're making me crazy. And then it was over and done with. Well, what's happening now in the ED rounds is kids are getting deferred, which means, okay, we're still interested in you, but not interested enough to give you an offer early. So we're gonna relook at you again with all the regular decision applicants. Now, those regular decision applications come out to a student who thinks it's gonna be done in mid-December, now is waiting until March, maybe the end of March. And then, by the way, they just found out they got put on a wait list. So now, they thought they would have a decision in March, and now it's just been pushed down the road to at least May 1 and after May 1. There are some schools, including the UCs, who don't let students know about their wait list until way into the summer. It could be June or July after they've graduated, right? So just so that we understand, this process is really long. And there is a point, and we will certainly guide everybody through this when they get those wait lists, But this year, there were actually more students who were getting waitlisted than were actually getting acceptances and rejections. So a lot of our seniors are sitting on waitlist right now and having the really tough decision of like, what do I do with that? And we'll guide them through in the ways that we need to, but it's important to understand that is not going away. That is going to be part of the next few years, at least. Why do colleges do it? Because they're protecting their yield, right? Like all of the rankings that we all look at, like best computer science schools, right? PUPS US News and World Report. Well, guess what? Part of that ranking on there is how many students say yes to the offers that they put out there. And so if you're thinking about it from those terms, they don't care so much about the students. And this isn't the admissions department, right? This is the university as a whole. The admissions department is just responsible for like hitting the priorities of that institution. They have a really hard job because they really do fight for the students. But they're protecting their yield. They want to know that you're going to come. So they're going to take the sure thing bet, or the one that they really think is going to come, even if they didn't apply in the early rounds. And so what that means is that the movement at the highly selective colleges is pretty low. So those waitlist options for those highly selective schools, so anything below a 20% acceptance rate, is very low. So we have a lot of students that are on Ivy League waitlist right now, and the chances of them getting off are extremely, extremely low, but they think there's a chance, right? So they're hanging on to hope, which I don't begrudge them in any way, because some of those schools are really schools they wanted to attend, but there becomes a point, and it's roughly around this time of the year, where they have to start getting excited about the other options that they actually have in front of them. And then should a waitlist spot open, we can revisit that, but it is extending, that cycle is extending. And so as a result of the long wait list, students are waiting longer into the year to deposit. So it used to be like you got into a school and you're like, all right, I'm gonna deposit right now, like March 15th, I'm in. And now students are really pushing it into like that May 1 deadline. So that just means everybody else stays on a wait list much longer than they maybe anticipated. So it's a little bit of a long road. So just again to reiterate, deferrals may turn into waitlist, and again, their waitlist may be longer than the acceptances and rejections that they had in the first place. So this whole idea of an alternate first year, like what the heck does that mean? Well, the colleges have gotten really creative, right? So instead of saying, hey, I'm gonna bring you in the fall of 2022, we're gonna offer you a spot in the spring instead. And so the reason we're gonna offer you a spot in the spring is because we're gonna have attrition, like kids aren't gonna come back, they're gonna struggle, so we're gonna have some spots open. There are gonna be other students who are already on those campuses, so let's call them like sophomores, juniors, who may be taking a semester abroad, right? So those open up spots in dorms and everything else. So what's happening is they are getting really creative with what is going on. So students are now like, oh my gosh, I got into Cornell. And then they're reading the next line, they're like, oh, I got into Cornell in August of 2023. What the heck am I supposed to do with that? Like, what am I supposed to do with the year? Right? But more colleges are starting to lean to this trend. And so they have to be prepared that if it's really a dream school of theirs, they have to think about like, how much am I willing to wait, or how much do I really want to go there? This is a trend that's also not going away. This is how they know for sure that they got high quality candidates that are gonna show up in the spring or in the following fall. So that also has a trickle down effect in terms of how many students they can take in the following, like in the class of 23. So just know that these are things that are starting to happen. There are some colleges that have a guaranteed transfer after 1 year. Some of those, Cornell happens to be one of them, right? So if you go to a particular college, they will say, hey, go to any school you want. Go to DVC, go to Tulane, go to NYU, go to wherever you got in, we don't care. As long as you maintain a certain GPA and you've taken the particular classes that we want you to take, you have guaranteed admission into our school a year later. So you don't really lose a year of school, but you lose a year of being a first-year student on that particular campus that you wanted to go to originally. So when you go through this, when the students go through this, they have to really think about like what's non-negotiable, right? I think about it in terms of buying a house, and when you buy a house, you've got this whole dream list of the things that you want, right? And then you start looking, you're like, okay, well, that's not possible. So you have to really stop and think about what are your non-negotiables? What are you really not willing to give up? For some, it may be, I'm not willing to start a year later. For others, it may be, I'm not willing to go start my first year abroad, because that's happening as well. Like there's programs you can go start in London for a semester. So you have to really start to think about like, what does it mean to you and what are you not willing to cave on? And then, is this dream really a dream? And then at that time too, start to think about like, what can I do in that gap year, right? And what is the college that is guaranteeing me admission the following year? What are they allowing me to do as well? So there's a lot of conversation that has to happen. So institutional priorities are favorite. This is something we have zero control over, right? So as admissions offices are reading through applications, we have stellar students who apply to fantastic schools that in theory they should be getting into, right? It doesn't make sense that like the 4.0 straight student is not getting into Northeastern. The reason is, well, there's a lot of reasons, but one of them is the institutional priorities. So what are we starting to see? So overall, applications have increased 12%, again, in Common App over the past 2 years. This is also where we've seen a lot of work happening in our nation with diversity and equity and inclusion. The colleges are doing a really nice job in leaning into that as well. So what we've seen is there's a 17% increase among traditionally underrepresented applicants. First generation applicants, so first generation is if the parents did not graduate from college, not that if you immigrated here, so first generation, if the parents didn't graduate from college, there's been a 22% increase, which is nearly twice the rate of every other increase over the past 2 years. And then international applicants have an uptick. Not surprising, right? Because 2 years ago, we were in COVID, a lot of applications, a lot of international students weren't coming, but that's starting to kick back up. Why is that? Well, why do colleges like them? Because they have to pay more than we do, even as a out-of-state resident. So it's a numbers game a little bit. So what are some institutional priorities? There are hundreds, not hundreds, but there are tons. So enrollment management being the big one. So how are they trying to balance what they need? So an institution will actually put out what they want the culture, what they want their population to look like. It then gets pushed down to the admissions offices where they're tasked with filling seats with those students who are going to meet those priorities, right? So did they over-enroll the previous year? Did they under-enroll the previous year? Were their yield rates higher than they expected? So that's impacting a little bit the class of 2022. Last year, a lot of colleges put out yeses, and more students said yes to those yeses. So that had a little bit of an impact in some colleges, not in many, but like in some colleges for the class of 22. They could be protecting their budgets, right? Getting back to the whole idea of like an international student or somebody who's a full pay student. Why wouldn't I take somebody who's gonna pay full tuition instead of having to consider financial aid for some of my other students? It unfortunately does make a difference. Military families are sometimes a priority as well. Like there's a GI Bill. So there's a whole bunch of things that kind of come into it. Do you have a special talent? Are you an athlete? Are you a legacy? Are you part of a diversified class? Like, are you a female from South Dakota who plays the oboe? I know that sounds crazy, but like, they can be that specific. So really starting to understand. And the other thing is this whole idea of relationships with high schools. I think this is something that a lot of people don't pay a lot of attention to. So if any of you have students or friends who have kids in private high schools, this is something that happens quite a bit, right? So those counselors in the private high schools have pretty strong relationships with the admissions offices. I believe in relationship building. It's kind of just one of those things that I've always believed in life. So we've done a really big push in our office to build those bridges and to have those conversations. It's really important for us to be able to understand so that we can guide students. It's also great for me to be able to call up and say like, hey, tell me what you see happening in the trends before it's kind of published out there to get a deeper dive into what they saw in general. So we work really hard to do that. And so, but that does matter. Like it actually does matter because what happens in committee behind the scenes as their admissions officers are talking, they will go into committee and start talking very specifically about their applicants, right? And there will be conversations about like Stephanie Brady as an applicant is sitting there and like, what do we know about her? Well, if I have a relationship with somebody who knows a little bit more about Stephanie because she goes to Miramani and I've been talking to the counselors there, I've got a little bit more to fight with, right? Like I can go to the committee and say like, no, listen, this is a really strong school. Like this is what's happening. Like, did you know this new initiative was added? So things like that are important, and we work hard on that. And then, of course, another one is the priority of the rankings. As much as I would love to throw the rankings out, I get why people look at them. I wish people would dive deeper into understanding like what those rankings are really about. I just met with a senior today going through the college decision, and she couldn't get beyond the rankings. And I'm like, well, what rankings are you looking at? And she's like, well, I don't know. I'm just looking at like, I don't know. And it wasn't even like anything reputable. But she was basing her decision on the rankings of those programs. And we're at the final stages, so like be careful of rankings, but it isn't a priority. So institutional priorities, you can't control. We have no idea what the institutional priorities are for a school. That is not something that is shared with anybody, right? I'm not even positive it's completely shared with the admissions officers of those schools. So we don't know, so the idea being, be as authentic as you can, think about the things that you enjoy in life and how your story is starting to evolve over the years so that you can tell your story in those applications. And recognize that there are many colleges that are absolutely looking for students just like you as the applicant. Don't get caught up on these rankings yourself, and recognize there are plenty of colleges that would be extremely happy to have any of our students. And by the way, when they're happy, they also give money. So what's not to like about that? All right, so true fact, 68% of colleges place some level of importance on demonstrated interest. Demonstrated interest used to be that you just you attended a college tour, or maybe you went to a college fair that was in your neighborhood, or you came to the admission representative. But that is also starting to increase. How we can start to show interest is increasing because everything's become very virtual in our world over the past 2 years. There are plenty of opportunities for students to really engage in a very real way. And so colleges are starting to track that a little bit more. Can't tell you how many times I actually had conversations this year with admissions reps about some students in particular where I was like, really, how did this student not get in to that college? Want to know what it was? Number one reason? Didn't show interest. Just applied. They thought it was a safety school, likely school. They just applied. And they did not engage. And that actually got them the demand. So there's two ways to look at this. One is you can look at it in terms of, okay, well, I'm going to show the school I'm really interested. I prefer to look at it in the way of, if I show the school I'm interested, what I'm actually gaining in return is knowledge about that school so that I can better understand whether or not that's a school I should actually be applying to. So instead of looking at it as something you have to do, look at something that you want to do so that you can better balance that list and be happy with all those schools on your list. So that little shift in narrative is really important to pay attention to. So authentic engagement is essential. So what that means is don't do things for the sake of doing it, right? Do it because you're really trying to get information and better understand what's happening. And it's more than just signing up for a campus tour, right? I mentioned earlier that a lot of colleges have added in these new concepts. You can sit in on classes. You can attend student panels. You can actually connect directly with admissions officers. Interviews are possibilities. So anything and everything you can do to get a sense of what that college is like, because I don't expect people to step on every single campus before they apply. It's expensive, it's time consuming, it's overwhelming, it's stressful. It's necessary in some situations. If you're gonna apply early decision, you absolutely better step on that campus before you do. But other than that, really be intentional with what you're trying to do to decide. So we built these lists starting in January for our juniors. We ended those conversations right before spring break. So with the intent that they should be spending the next 3 to 4 months digging deep into those colleges so that when they come back in August, their list is 90% there. But it takes time. They have to invest the time. Other ways that they can show interest is they can write a thoughtful YS essay. So this may be going a little deep in the weeds, but there are supplemental essays that occur when you apply to college. The biggest supplemental essay that a college will ask is why do you want to come to this school? So that research that you've done is really important to take note of, because when you go back to write that, it becomes extremely authentic. And you're relating it to yourself and what you've learned, and they like that. And then, like I said, they can engage on multiple levels. They can come to college visits at our school, which, by the way, college visits happen in the fall, and juniors and seniors are allowed to come. Juniors are limited to 2 in the year. Seniors can come unlimited numbers. And we host about 150 different colleges in the fall, so starting from second week in August to November. And it's a fantastic way for students to have a small experience and really gauge what that college is about by interacting with that admissions officer who is actually going to be reading their application. Right, standardized testing. Standardized testing is crazy. But it is making a comeback, right? So if we look at it in terms of, we went test optional, students couldn't get tests. In the class of 2022, 1,850 colleges went test optional. What that means is if you didn't submit a test, if you didn't want to submit a test, if you couldn't take a test, it was not counted against you. What it really means is if you were able to take a test and submit it and do well, then you were gonna get a little bit of a boost in your application. Not a big boost, but it would count like an extracurricular activity, like a super extracurricular, right? And not at all colleges. Some colleges are truly test optional. It does not matter. They look at you and they don't take that into consideration. but we are starting to move back. So what we know about the class of 23 is already there's about 1,400 colleges that are test optional or test blind. The UCs are test blind. They've gotten rid of the ACT and SAT indefinitely. The Cal State schools have also gone test blind, so at least for next year. So what we don't know is what's going to continue to happen, but what I will say is there are some trends. So MIT just announced, some of you might have seen it in the news, MIT just announced that they are requiring tests again next year. Georgetown required tests again this year. There are states who never got into the test optional. Florida, as a state school, so any public schools in Florida, you've always had to submit a test. Even in the pandemic, they require a test. If you're looking at some of the military academies, they require a test. And then there's this whole other side of like scholarships and testing. So sometimes scholarships are a little dependent as to whether or not you submitted a test score, and even in a test optional world, submitting a test score could increase merit aid depending upon how you did and what they're looking for. All right, so what does that mean? Basically what that means is everybody should plan to take the test. I don't care if you're a freshman, I don't care if you're a sophomore, I don't care if you're a junior. If you have the opportunity, the overall advice is take the test. Now, some of the juniors that we've met with, we've had very specific conversations with them. So if you happen to be a parent of a junior right now and you're like, are you telling my child not to take the test? That's because it was a very individualized conversation. That's really what we try and do in our office as well, is like really individualize those moments that we need to. So there are situations where you wouldn't take it, but if you are a parent of a freshman or a sophomore sitting in here, full on be prepared to have your child take that test. If we get into a situation where we're still test optional, then we can talk about that later, but for right now, I want you to kind of have it on your radar that you should be thinking about it. And the ideal time to test is in like March of junior year. There are kids that take it, in August of their junior year. Anything before that, I would not recommend. Sometimes colleges won't even look at the test if it was taken in sophomore year. So we have time, but just know that it's something that we should be thinking about, and we'll keep you up to date on that. Okay, fit to major. What does that mean? So what that means is you're interested in business. Well, what are you doing in your life right now that's showing that you fit with a business major, right? So like what extracurriculars are you doing? What classes are you taking at your school? If you're a computer science major and you've never taken a computer science class at Miramani, it's going to raise a question like, well, do they really want to apply computer science? Is that really their interest? How do they know that, right? So one of the things that's also important about this is being authentic, like following what you like to do. Trust me, it's really important. I think this is a lesson for all adults too. In the moments where we're pretty aligned with what we value, those are probably the moments in your life where you feel most connected and maybe feel a lot more joy. It's not any different when we're talking about the college application process. So really start to get engaged in important and intentional ways. So that's what we want you to take away from this. Especially at the large public universities, when you have to apply into a particular school within that university, let's say, it's really important to be able to understand like why you want to select that major. It's not always easy to switch when you get to school. For some schools it is, but for some it's not. So you have to really be able to start to understand what does that look like. Now, I'm not saying that you should go apply to all these summer programs and pay a whole lot of money, but think like really truly what you like to do, right? Are you somebody who cares a lot about the environment and about eating healthy? So maybe you have a garden that you grow some tomatoes and you go to like one of the retirement homes and you share that with people. Like start to think about how you can get engaged in your own life in ways that you haven't before. That is the authentic story, right? Like that's how you stand apart from somebody else, just purely because you're being true to who you are and not doing things for the sake of doing them because you think that's what the college might want. Getting back to those institutional priorities, you don't really know what they want, right? It also demonstrates the students' knowledge and skills, right? So if, getting back to computer science, it's just an easy example, but if you want to be a computer science major and you don't know any coding, like, how are you gonna do that, right? Like, what are you gonna do? You don't know what the word Java means and you think it's a cup of coffee, like, it's not okay. Like, you have to really think about this. So really starting to get involved, and that's a growing trend, right? So colleges are wanting to understand like how you differentiate yourself. All right, so what does that mean? Passion projects. They need to be related to your narrative. Like, what do you already do? This isn't like rocket science. I think we make it all way more complicated than it needs to be. So like, truly take a step back. What you can do as parents is really talk to your kids about like, what gets them excited? Like, what are they excited to do when they wake up in the morning? Besides play Xbox or PlayStation. But like, but maybe there is something there, right? Like maybe gaming, maybe they have an interest in gaming in some capacity and they want to understand game theory. Well, game design and game theory are actually majors in college. So let's talk about that. Like, what does that look like? So getting to be really authentic in what you like and what you enjoy and bringing that forward is important. And then taking elective classes. So we all have to take certain classes, you know, like 4 years of English here, 2 years of math, foreign language. But what are you doing with your elective classes? Like if you're somebody who wants to go into science and you never took an AP like science class, well, do you really want to go into science, right? So start to think about that and being intentional as you're going through and picking course schedules. I know we've already done that for this year, but just thinking forward in terms of what you want to do. Competitive majors. Computer science has been in the news for a really long time. What has been really surprising is business. So business has had a huge increase, right? University of Pittsburgh, not typically a school you think about as a business school, right? It's very big in STEM, it's got a medical school affiliated with it. The acceptance rate at University of Pittsburgh this year for business was 10%. Wow. What does that mean? That means it was a dream school if you wanted to apply for business at University of Pittsburgh. Shocking, right? It actually dropped from 55%, right? So I'm sure you've had conversations with your kids, and what we hear in our office all the time is, I want to be in engineering, I want to go into psychology, I want to go into nursing, and I want to be a business major. I'm like, how do you know you want to be a business major? We don't offer a single business class in your money. Like, how do you know that? Well, that's what my dad does. Well, okay, that's great, but like, do you really know what your dad does? Because if you were to ask my kids, they'd be like, I don't know, he crunches numbers or something like that. So to be able to really understand what that means, and to, again, go find those opportunities for you to be exposed to the business side of the world so that you can understand, like, do I want to go into finance? Do I want to go into marketing? You know, do I want to go into some other area of business, and to really start to uncover that? And by the way, uncovering it could be having a conversation with your parents who might be in business, or talking to your aunt and uncle who might be in business. Like, tell me what that was like for you attending our career night that we just had. Like really starting to engage in those preliminary conversations to get an understanding of what it might look like to be in that type of situation. It's hard to get internships as a high schooler, I understand that, but there are definitely ways that you can engage. So what that means is if you're applying to a competitive major, so some of the ones that I mentioned, that means that your list is going to look a whole lot different, right? So if you are applying to computer science, and I'm sorry I keep going back to that, but it's a really easy one because there's a lot of information out there on it that I can remember in my mind at this point. But computer science, if you're applying to computer science, University of Washington is a good example, because University of Washington, if you were to look at their overall acceptance rate, it runs around like a 50-55% acceptance rate. So it's like, oh, great, if I apply to University of Washington, big popular school for us, I've got a 50-50 shot of getting in. Well, not so quickly. So they're an out-of-state public school, so they're giving preference to their in-state residents, right? In computer science, the acceptance rate is 3% at University of Washington as an out-of-state resident. Overall, it's 55%, right? So there's all these nuanced things that we need to really pay attention to. So that means that your list is gonna look a little different. Really, another really important one, that this is so shocking to me, San Jose State. So San Jose State University, it's a Cal State school, and the way that they look at their applicants is they don't take test scores, they don't take essays, it's an index review. So when we had test scores, they looked at your test score and they looked at your GPA. Now they just look at your GPA and your A through G requirements, right? And so computer science, again, because this is shocking, we had a student walk in who was like, does this really say I was rejected from San Jose State? I'm like, how's that possible, right? This kid had a 4.3 GPA, like 4.3, he was rejected. I got on the phone with San Jose State. And I'm like, could you please explain this to me? Like, I really don't understand. So in their index review, they have a slight calculation. His index eligibility was 3,440 with a 4.3 GPA. And basically it's like a calculation of your GPA, some nuances, times 800, and then there's a couple other points that can be added in. The minimum GPA, or the minimum eligibility requirement was 3,480, which on a strict GPA was a 4.35. Now, again, there are some other things. If you're a first-generation student, there's like 200 points extra that you get. If you happen to live in the local context of San Jose, there's another 200 points. So there were things, so I'm not being quite transparent, but he got rejected from San Jose State with a 4.3 because he needed a 4.35. So I'm sure here in San Jose State, many of you were like, okay, like that's not such a hard school to get into. Well, maybe not, but maybe it is. And so again, if we have juniors in the room and you are looking at your child's list and you're thinking like, oh, does this college in Crescent really know what they're talking about? Like, how is this possible? Because you just put San Jose State as a reach school for my child who's got like a straight 4.0. We do know what we're talking about because it really comes down to that major. So pay attention to those nuances. Let us know if you have questions. Understand that San Jose State is not the end all be all. Now, of course, we can imagine it's low because it sits in San Jose, right? Like it's in the heart of Silicon Valley, essentially. So it makes sense, but it's not something that we would normally think of. Taking initiative outside of the classroom is really important. And then consider alternate routes. There are other ways to do computer-based things that don't have to be computer science related. So to start to think outside of the box and other ways that you might want to go into that major is important. Okay, we're getting to the end. I promise you're probably tired of hearing from me. So new application profile. So it used to be, you sent in a basic application, you wrote a couple essays. New things are starting to pop up as a way for colleges to evaluate students. And they include a resume. So we're working with our students on putting together resumes. They include art portfolios, even if you're not applying into like an art degree program. If you are an artist as a hobby, it could be something that you might want to submit as well because it just adds character to what you're already got on there. Audition tapes, the same type of thing. And then a lot of kids are starting websites, right? So they were actually on many college applications this year. You could put your URL. Don't put your TikTok on there. Like websites that you might have actually started, you can include. I had a student who does makeup, does kind of fancy makeup for theater type productions, and she had a website that she had started, and that was her URL that she put up there. And it had nothing to do with her application other than it showed another side of her that wasn't seen. I mean, it was in one of her essays, but it didn't show in any other way. So it was a really nice way for a college to be able to get a different glimpse of her. All right, so in the end, I'm going to kind of start at the bottom. Remember, there is only one you. We are all individual in our own right. That is the story that you need to tell. That is what you're trying to get across in all of this. So what does that mean? That means be authentic. Think again about what you enjoy, what you like, combine them together. Our kids are really creative and they're extremely innovative, and they just need to be given permission to think about that and how that comes together. We can help them, you can help them. It's just really important that they understand that they do matter and what they do does count. And in the end, it is not about the college you get into, it's about who you are, because who you are is why you're going to be successful on any college campus you go to. So by us really embracing that, encouraging that, and fostering that, our kids are going to feel a lot less stressed. You're going to feel a lot less stressed. And in the end, they're going to be happy. So take initiative, embrace all of that, discover your story, build it, tell it. This is a 3-year process. We have a philosophy in our center that really helps build on that. And in the end, just really know it is going to be okay. I know that some of this information might have been a little shocking tonight. I did not mean to shock anybody. I hope you don't walk away being like, oh shoot, how am I ever gonna get my child through this? That was not my intention. Our intention was really to let you know that this is what's happening. Knowledge is power, right? When you know what's out there and when you know what needs to be done, we can act on it, right? We can act on this. So you're not alone as a parent. Your students are not alone in applicants. We're here to support you. We want them to come in and ask questions. We want you to know that it will be okay. Going back to that original slide that we started with, our students are doing really well. They are meant to do well because they're paying attention to what matters. So the more that we encourage that, the more successful everybody's gonna be. So, questions? Are you asking who's telling the truth?
No.
Kind of.
Well, yeah, actually, I've heard some people say okay, that's cool. Why are you telling us about track interest? I hate it would be like this from somebody else in another district. And yeah, so are they going to come
How are they communicating that?
Yeah.
So I think on our demonstrated interest, do we have a link on that one? I can't remember either. If not, I'll go back. There's a link. We have a couple links that will show like who tracks demonstrated interest and like how much they might track it. So I'll make sure it's on this presentation. It's not accurate for 2022 per se, but it's accurate for the last year, maybe 2020. But to answer the question, if you were sitting next to an applicant and you look exactly the same on every level, and one showed interest in a really authentic way, that's the person who's going to get the offer, right? Are colleges going to come out and advertise that? Probably not. But again, getting back to demonstrated interest, it's a tough one because we think of it in terms of something we have to do, and I want to think of it in terms of something we want to do, so that we can better educate ourselves around, like, is this really a school that should be on my list to begin with? So I do think colleges are leaning that way. They lean more that way when it's a private institution. They lean more that way when it's like the Ivies, the UCs, they're not tracking it. But University of Michigan does, like as a public institution, like they definitely track it. Not in a major way, but they track it in a moderate way. So I bring up demonstrated interest in this presentation for the sheer fact that I want people to know it's out there. But I don't want them to use it as a tool to get in. I want them to use it as a tool to really figure out if that's where they should be applying in the first place. I know it doesn't quite answer, but we'll make sure that we put the link in there. Other questions? Yeah?
What about all the kids who don't know if they want?
Hard, right? So, no, it really is hard. So, what year is your child?
I'm a junior.
You're a junior. So you just missed the big initiative that we rolled out. Okay, so we recognize that that's a problem, right? And like it's really hard. You know which one, but it's a good question, right? So I don't know if everybody heard the question. The question was, if you don't, what happens if your child doesn't know what they want to do when they're applying? Well, a lot of options. One, there's a liberal arts college, right? Which there's a big turn towards liberal arts again, in which you can go and you can kind of take a whole plethora of classes and decide what you like once you're in college and you're taking college level classes. So one option. But the other one is, this is true for the class of 24 and subsequent classes going after them. We created a Get to Know Yourself workbook this year, in which we are walking students, we launched it to the sophomores in February, and we're walking them through, it's about 7 different exercises that we're walking, they were all tagged into Academy, and they have a physical workbook that they should have. And we're walking them through like really how to, one, identify your values, how those values show up in different things that you do, how they start to align. So we're trying to teach them to connect those dots to who they are, because values honestly aren't supposed to change throughout your life. They might shift a little bit, but if your core values are truly your values, and not because of fear in any way, they don't really shift that much. We kind of have them by the time you hit high school. So that is a way that we are trying in our office to help them figure that out. There's also different assessments that can be done on Naviance that will shoot out majors, and there's a really great part of Berkeley's website. So there are ways that we can do it, but it's hard, right? I mean, it does require actually doing some work and figuring it out, and trying things on for size. Does that answer the question?
Following on her question, actually, so what are the acceptance rates for undecided, like applying as undecided?
They're not really any different. So if you apply, if a college actually has an undecided major, it actually doesn't hurt you in any way. Like they look at it just as if you were applying to history, right? Undecided usually falls in the letters and sciences category, and if you're applying to a big institution and going undecided, then you have the option to pretty much pick any of those, like let's call it 65 majors within that branch when you're there. So undecided doesn't impact you in any way. Now I say that again, there's also institutional, like it's not as black and white. Nothing in here, like for all purposes, like what I say tonight could actually shift next week, right? So like this is information I have as of today, and I don't anticipate it shifts next week, but it's always changing, and there are always instances, like it depends is a big statement that you hear in college advising, because it really does. It depends on the student, it depends on the major, it depends on the activities you're interested in, it depends on, like there's a lot that happens. But for the most part, undecided does not impact you in any negative way. Other questions? Yeah?
So if your child thinks that they want to study business but doesn't get into that business school, there's no possible way then that they will get it.
Sometimes. So like for instance, like I'll use TCU as an example because TCU has a pre-major in business. So like if you apply as a student to TCU and you don't get into their business school, if you have checked in your application that you're willing to be considered for pre-major, they will then consider you for that pre-major. in which case, as a pre-major, you have the opportunity, if you do well, you should have a pretty seamless process getting into that business school. But there are some schools where there is no pre-major option, so you're either applying into that business school, or you're taking a chance and getting into that college and hoping that you're gonna get in, and it's not always an easy process. So if students really know what they wanna do, and I go back to the computer science example a little bit, because that's the easier one to describe. If you know you wanna do computer science and you don't get accepted into a computer science school, don't go there. The chances of getting in are like next to none once you're there. Business is a little bit different, because there's so many different facets of business that you can enter in, but that's a situation where we'd have to look very specifically at that college and find out what their program might be. Like University of Virginia, like they have the whole commerce school, like nobody can apply to that as a freshman. They actually have to be, like as an applicant, you can't apply into that school. You have to be there in your first year, and then you apply in the first semester of your sophomore year. So there are some colleges like that too, where it's not even an option until you get there to apply. And then you're up against everybody else, and you may or may not get in. So there are things to consider for sure. Yeah. Other question? Yeah.
What happens if you're stuck on a wait list after the national commit day?
Yeah, fantastic question. So stuck on a wait list after May 1 when you had a deposit, you have to deposit someplace. So when it comes time to depositing, May 1 is typically the national decision day deadline. So one college you have to participate, you have to deposit. Every other college you are no longer like technically accepted to, right? Even if you didn't let them know, your offer is gone because it's beyond May 1. If you get off a wait list, then you forego your deposit that you already put on, right? So when you get waitlisted, you have the option to opt in or not. And sometimes they give you an opportunity to send some more information in to consider in your application. But you can still be, and you can remain on 5 wait lists if you want, but you can only deposit to one school. So if you get off that wait list, you're foregoing your deposit at the one school, and you're gonna now deposit at the new school. Yeah?
So once you say your deposit is set at one school, does every other college that you apply to now know that you have accepted? And then if you are on the wait list on those, who they take you off?
No, so if you opt into the wait list, they will keep you on the wait list for as long as you want to remain on that wait list. Some of the colleges are really transparent, and they'll say, we're keeping our wait list open until June 1, and after June 1, like that's it, we're not going to our wait list anymore. So, but the colleges don't, like if you deposit at UCLA, let's say, nobody else knows that you've deposited at UCLA, including the other UCs. Only UCLA knows that you've deposited there, right? So you, as an applicant, have to go tell your other colleges that you've deposited and withdraw your acceptances to those places.
Oh, so it's not in the system,
It's not in a system that everybody can see.
but early decision is in the system.
Early decision's not in the system either. No. No. Now, in theory, getting to the whole early decision thing, colleges can talk to each other, right? Does it happen? It happens, not as much as you would think it happens, but there's not like a generalized system that all of the information is captured in. It's really dependent, it's really reliant on the applicant themselves to communicate all of that.
Money. So,
They're trying to mess up.
do we want to give them some responsibility financial for the whole cost of college? Or if we have the possibility, we just tell them, hey, we're gonna pay for everything, don't worry about it.
So that's a personal family decision. And it's a hard one to answer, right? So if you were to ask my opinion, I love when students have some skin in the game, right? I mean, I think in general, in life, if it means something to us, we do something. But it could look very different ways, right? Like the parents could give the child a loan versus them actually having to take a loan out. There's a lot of different ways it can look. It's really a personal family decision and what you want to do and what you're hoping to instill in terms of certain responsibilities in your children. Maybe it's a gift that you want to give that you say, you know what, I'll pay for your first 4 years, but like medical school, you're on your own. But those are conversations that should be happening in households as early as like first year, right? Like as we start to, no, I'm not saying go have like, hey, just listen to Mrs. Brady and like, by the way, we need to talk about the college budget, even though you're not graduating until 2025. But you should be thinking about it at least as the adults in the house, and then starting to have those conversations with your children so they recognize it's a privilege to go to college, by the way. Like I know we live in a town where 93% of our students go on, 97% I think of our class go on to college, but it's a privilege to go. And the expectation of the colleges is it's the student's responsibility to pay, right? Like that's how they go into this. Now they'll take family information, financial information, but when you fill out the financial aid forms, it is the student's financial aid application. So in theory, it's the onus is on the student to pay. Now, that's not always what happens, right? But that's how it's looked at. And again, it is the expectation that the student family pays, and the colleges will give money if there is need. If there's financial need, they will give money, and then there's merit aid that you get to. But in terms of like how that money gets paid for to that college, it's really just a family decision. Yeah.
I've been thinking for a sophomore, what should they be thinking about at this point?
They should be thinking about the summer, and like what they want to do. And so the summer could be, you know, I'm gonna go get a job. I love jobs, by the way. Any job, I don't care. Go flip burgers at McDonald's, like honestly, because the college is gonna say, okay, this kid actually took some initiative and went to a job that probably most people don't love, but they did it anyway, right? And so having that responsibility and all the kind of learning that comes from having a job is really important. I love jobs. So like if anyone's trying to figure out what to do with your child this summer, job is really good. And colleges like it too. I mean, again, not that we're doing it for the colleges, but like in terms of getting a job or paying $5,000 to go to do a program at like a pre-college program at Wash U. Well, unless it's a program that you really want to go to that you think is going to help tell that story that you're already starting to create for yourself, like maybe the job's a better option, right? You want to go into business? Like, guess what? Having a job is like kind of important. Because you start to learn how to like balance your own finances. You start to learn that the government takes in money. Like you start to learn all of these things that you wouldn't necessarily know any other way. So thinking about the summer in an intentional way. It does not have to be anything big. Starting to do the workbook that we had, right? Like starting to pay attention to what we value. Thinking about in terms of the elective classes that they might have signed up for, like how does that kind of align with something that you think you might have an interest in? I don't expect them to have it figured out, right? Like the majority of people on a college change their major 2 to 3 times. Like that's a statistic. So I don't expect them to have it figured out at, you know, even 16 years old. But to start to be really thoughtful about what they're trying to do and what they're trying to accomplish is the best thing for a sophomore. Hold on, go back in, yeah.
What about scholarships? Is that a straightforward thing, or what things to keep in mind? Like you said, changing majors or college university.
The question was scholarships. Is that what you asked me? Yeah, so how do I didn't hear the whole thing. How do scholarships?
Are there things to keep in mind, like if you change majors or?
Oh, sometimes. Usually not so much when you're first applying in, right? So when you're first applying in, the colleges themselves might have some specific scholarships that are aligned with the major that you chose, but usually not as a first year, like as a freshman entering. Oftentimes when you're on those college campuses, certain departments might have scholarships that you can apply for, but that's after you're already a student, right? So major doesn't always apply to the scholarship situation, but what it does, there's like, I think roughly $1 billion of scholarship money that's untapped every year. It's a crazy amount of money. And sometimes they're very nuanced scholarships, right? There's a great book called The Ultimate Scholarship Guide that we have some copies in our office if anybody wants to borrow them, but it's a really great book to start to look at because it breaks down thousands of scholarships into many categories. So sometimes it is major specific and sometimes it's different. And if you were to change that major, honestly, if it wasn't related to the school, they're not gonna suddenly say, give me back my $1,000, right? Like if it's an outside independent scholarship, it's not gonna matter. Those are more merit-based scholarships. Anything that's need-based, it does not matter at all what you are going to study. It just matters like what can your family afford to pay, and the calculations are based off of that. So, does that answer the question? Okay. Any other? Yeah.
I have a sophomore also. Can you describe a little bit what the relationship that they are gonna have with you or with your team look like going forward?
Sure. So we met with them all, we tagged them all, and had conversations when we introduced this Getting to Know You workbook. So that's where it started in February. It was supposed to happen in December, but because of COVID, things got bumped. So it was in February, and we went through the workbook with them. So they should continue to be working on it. It was meant to take them through a year. So kind of February sophomore year till January of junior year when we really start to pick them up. So we don't do a lot with them other than what we just did with them sophomore year. So that's kind of their thing for sophomore year. And then as we go into junior year, there will be a presentation. It's really January of junior year that things shift. For all the sophomore parents in here, starting next year, we've been doing this for the past couple of years, but all juniors will get an email from us once a month that will be walking you through just kind of what you need to know, and it goes to both parents and to students. So everyone's getting the same information. And it's kind of just a prep. So that will start in August when we get back to school. And then when we get into January of junior year, we start to send like every other week. So it's like twice a month emails. And then when we get into senior year, in that fall of senior year, it's a weekly email. We have so much content that we have put together, and there's parent presentations, and there's presentations specifically for the juniors. So looking ahead, what happens is, aside from those emails, there's a presentation in January just for the students. They get tagged in January of their junior year. And then actually next Tuesday, we're taking the show on the road again a little bit and speaking to just the rising seniors. So that presentation happens in April, and that's for parents and students to attend together. And then, I don't know if any of you have checked out our website, but we did a really big overhaul of the website in the fall and kind of going into the winter. So essentially, like, everything you need to know, like the basics, are there. And then also in January of junior year, we put together a comprehensive college handbook that's specified to each individual class. So in January of next year, the class of 24 will also receive that handbook. And it's very specific to just kind of the basics that you need to know, and then things that are specific to Miramani and those processes. In addition, we also send out in the weekly emails as seniors is a weekly timeline and checklist. It's a really big undertaking. I think there was one, I mean, there's a lot that I hope you take away from tonight, but one thing that you could help us with in our office is people should be looking at college and career, as our office, as like another class that students are taking. And so what I mean by that is we have done tons of presentations. We've run academy sessions twice a week. They're targeted to topics. Students can sign up. The information is out there. The website is intended to be like a go-to resource. We support 1,200 kids in our office every year. It's a lot. We're only supposed to be working 40 hours a week. Like I'm actually the only full-time technical person. Shannon is 20, and then Jen and Ariel are both 10. So together, we only have 2 full-time people, right? I can assure you that you are getting the work of 8 full-time people, and that is actually no exaggeration. So what we need people to start to recognize is you can help us by going and finding the information, because we've made it really accessible. So check out the website, check out the college handbook, check out the getting to know you stuff, read the emails that we send. Interestingly enough, like 2 seniors today came to me and said, I had no idea I had to deposit by May 1. I'm like, you gotta be kidding me. Like, how do you not know that? Like, it's literally on a sandwich board outside my office. Like, how do you not know that? I don't know, but it's happening. So our big ask of you, aside from like supporting your students, is to really, to take the initiative to recognize the information that's out there, and then come to us with individual meetings. So we don't really meet individually with sophomores. We definitely had some meetings where sophomores came in and they wanted some guidance on classes, and we're happy to do that. We work in collaboration with counseling when that has to happen as well. The counselors are going to tell them what they need to do to graduate. I can give them a little bit of a perspective from a college lens in terms of what they might be interested in and make some suggestions. But we're not meeting individually really until you get to your junior year. And then junior year, it's an optional meeting. And we will continue to build college lists for students next year as well. As much as we were ready to say goodbye to it, I really do think that it was important to do. And I think I hope anyway, it benefited the students who got those lists. So we'll continue to do all that. There's a lot that you get. I honestly, I mean, it's hard for me to say this a little bit because I don't want it to come across as arrogant, but I do think that what we do in our office is kind of different than anything else you're going to see out there, and I will equate it even to what you might see in a private high school situation. And so take advantage of the fact that you have a fantastic resource within your school that you do not have to pay for, that is truly here because we care about the kids. And so we see so much wellness come through our office as well. Who was it? We had one student that said we're like protein bars. What did they say, Shannon?
You're like a protein bar.
Right. One of the biggest compliments that we got this year was from a senior who basically said, for the most stressful part of my entire high school career that takes place in this office, this is the only place that I really want to be. Right? So like that kind of makes our year in a lot of ways. So we do care, and we really do want to help. And we recognize that everybody needs a little bit of guidance and support through this. And so your job and the job for your students is to like take that first step in figuring out what you need to know and then come to us with questions when you have them. And that.
What you were saying just struck another question. So for a student who's not going into a STEM major, how important is it to take 4 years of science?
So another, it depends, is my answer. So it depends on what type of list they're trying to build, right? So I think to think of it in terms of, we have these elective options, right? Are we gonna take 6 or 7 classes our junior and senior year? Like, what are we thinking? And how else are we getting in what's important to us, right? So in the core curriculum, so science being one of them, there's a whole push a couple years ago that physics should be a class. Now listen, I'm not saying physics should be for everybody, because I don't necessarily agree with that. But it's a rare instance where I'm gonna tell you shouldn't take physics, right? So if you're a theater major, if you are a drama major, if you wanna go into like a conservatory for music, that's a different conversation, right? Like, do you need 4 years of science? Probably not. So it really gets very nuanced in those situations, but in general, I would love for kids to have 4 years of science. Like, I'd love for kids to have 4 years, honestly, of like world language, science, social science, and English. English you have to have. And math. So, but again, not for everybody, right? Like, if you suck at math, like, who really wants to take more math? Like, no way. But Viramonte's pretty good in the sense that we have a lot of great electives to think about. So 4 years of science, we can talk separately on that, but in general, I would say yes, if possible. Any other questions? Yeah.
Appreciated the list, the college list. Would you suggest, certainly the Logan Mirror, and some of the other schools that we're looking at, go back to you guys to make sure, because you have it all in specific categories.
Yeah.
So that there's lists of balance between math and majors. Are you able to look at these and following the right spots?
So yes and no. So the college list we gave to them, and on the top of that college list were like 4 different resources that they could utilize to continue to research. So the lists were meant to be foundational. It was not for us to say like, these are the schools you should definitely apply to, right? It's a 30-minute conversation in a form that they filled out that's helping us really get to know them a little bit better. It's not enough to know them totally. The onus is then on them to go do the research and to build that list out. When we get back in August, when I think I mentioned earlier that we should be about 90% there, they should have then filled out that list. We can at that point go back and say like, hey, yeah, no, this is more of a likely school. This is definitely a target school. But they should have a lot of that information just purely from what we've already taught them. But of course, there's gonna be changes that happen. And we'll also know a little bit more after we see more results from this year as well. For the most part, I don't think it's gonna shift in any big capacity, because when we built those lists, we had a lot of knowledge from this year already behind us. So I'm not worried about that in any way. We have had students come back and say, so I decided that I don't wanna do this now. Can you build me a new list? I'm like, what? Seriously, and it's not that I'm opposed to building the list, but I think there's this fine line of how much do we guide them and how much do we have to pull them along. And so I'm a really big believer in the more ownership you take of this process, like as a student, the more empowered you feel, the better you feel in the end of this entire thing. So the more they can start to do on their own, the better they're gonna feel. And of course I don't expect them, I'm not sending them out to the wolves, right? So they can certainly come back to us, but that's probably more of a conversation in August after they've done some deep dive research into those schools. Any other questions? Yeah.
Could you explain a little about how the schools look at rigorous classes from different, you know, I guess I meant other classes around the country. So you see differently, is that based on the ranking of the high school or the specifics of the class?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. So when college admissions officers are looking at applications, they get something called a school profile. And you can find our school profile, it's on our website right now under general resources. And I think it's under the counseling website as well. There's a couple different places you can find it. What that school profile does is it tells in like 2 pages, it tells that college what our school's about. So it talks everything from like, what is the town of Orinda like how big is it? It talks about the current senior class and what they look like academically after their junior year. So what's the average number of AP classes they took? What was the average SAT, ACT score? What's the average GPA? What is the highest GPA and how many students have that? What's the highest weighted So there's a lot of, how many AP classes do we offer? What does our sports program look like? Like, it basically outlines in a summary what Miramani looks like. So when an applicant is being looked at, and they don't know our school very well, they're gonna refer to that, and that becomes the context of which they're gonna now evaluate that applicant. So, at our school, on average, our students take 5.6 AP honors classes across, 5.3, sorry, AP honors classes across their 4 years, right? And so, are you somebody who took, 7? Are you somebody who took 2? Like, how do you compare to your students? There's also another part of the application that goes out that the counselors complete when they send in their letters of recommendation. It's called the secondary score report, and they then have opportunities, because they know the students and what they look like, so they have opportunities to check boxes in terms of, is it the top 20%, the top 50%, like what does that look like for that student across certain categories? So they get that information when a counselor submits a letter of recommendation as well. So they do have that information. A lot of the colleges that our students are applying to, most of the colleges know who we are because we tend to apply to the same colleges. But in our effort to try and expand that, some colleges might not know that well. One of the things that I'm trying to do is I'm trying to bring in a blind college fair next year. I'm working on it. I've got college admissions reps. The reason I want to do it is because we get so attached to the names. The way the blind college fair works is those colleges put together a fact sheet about who they are without their name attached to it in any capacity. Students go into, let's say, into our cafeteria or into our gym or whatever it might be, and they start to have conversations, not knowing what that college is. So now they're really paying attention to what that college might offer that aligns with what they might be looking for, right? Then we go into a bigger presentation. I'm still kind of planning this as we go, but we go into a bigger presentation where I might be able to get a couple colleges to really run through how they evaluate X applicant, right? And then we'll go back in and they're gonna reveal who they are. And now you start to have conversations with the colleges with the name attached. And to just get a sense of okay, I didn't actually know anything about Beloit, but I really love that school. Aside from the fact that it's in the Midwest, right? Because our kids are I'll apply east, I'll apply west, nothing in the middle. Typical conversation, not a lot. So just ways so that, aside from the colleges just knowing who we are, the students start to recognize who colleges are beyond what they already know. Yeah?
So, early decision looks like your chances are better. Do you have clarity at specific schools that looks better, but that's really all their athletes, legacies? So you can't score actually better?
So we have some of that, right? So a lot of schools kind of hold that pretty close. But it gets back to those relationships that we have with some of those colleges. We can get that information. But yes, that does happen, right? So in the early rounds, all recruited athletes are taken and they roll them. They have to apply for them. So yes, there's a portion of that happens, right? And then there's a whole legacy component. There's a lot of preference given to the smaller private schools mostly that are looking at the legacy component. So they may also come into the early decision round. And then that leaves not as many slots available. So we do have some of that information, but it's not as easy to get as you would, well, maybe you would imagine it's not easy to get, but we do have some of that. Yeah.
So, my kid is in junior, she thinks that it's more important to prepare for the SATs, to increase her GPA to the maximum, than to prepare for the SAT, and several steps. And, she's using that private tutoring, just for the APs, she said, don't worry about the SAT.
So I would say, it actually gets back probably to the second part of your rigor question. I don't think I fully answered either. So from a rigor perspective, colleges are looking at a couple of trends, right? They're looking to see how did you continue to increase your challenge in academics throughout 4 years, right? So as freshmen, you can't even take an AP class here. But how did you continue to do that? What is the average student that takes AP honors classes at your high school, right? And then how are you doing in those classes? How, are you getting the big thing is, if I get a B in an AP class, it's just as good as getting an A in a regular class, right? Kind of, right? It's not really, right? They would probably rather see that you took that rigorous class because you're challenging yourself. And in terms of AP classes, my personal philosophy is do not take an AP class unless you actually like that subject matter. It takes a lot of time, it's a lot of effort, and the more APs you take, the more stress kids tend to get. So like, don't take it unless you like it. Like, who wants to take history when you hate history? Like, I don't want to take AP World if I hate history. So again, it's telling that story, right? Like, it's continuing to say, I'm not just taking, now we have kids who will take 5 or 6 AP classes in a given year, right? It doesn't happen as often as everybody thinks, but it does happen. And so in terms of like studying for the tests, as a junior, like I would want to have that conversation specifically with her because I would want to understand like where she really is thinking about applying, and if she took the PSAT in October and what that looked like, and like it's a bigger conversation, but I'm not saying that she shouldn't take that test. Are you gonna go back and say something where you said you need to take that test?
No, she's taking the
She
test,
is.
no matter what. but
She's just not covering for it as much
She's like, I don't care about it.
because it doesn't matter.
Because they-
Well, then why are you taking the test? That would be my question to her. Like, why are you even taking the test? If it doesn't matter to you, like, why are you taking it? So if you're going to take it, then put some effort into getting ready for it, or you're wasting your time, meaning her time. Go ahead, Evan.
I know you said that you were first and second year students plan on having to take SAT.
Yeah.
So is this going to be some kind of new SAT that they're in the process of creating right now?
Yeah.
Or is it the same old SAT that they've always had? I thought it was considered discriminatory.
So it's really interesting, right? Because MIT just came out and said, well, the reason we're instituting tests back is because we actually think it's discriminatory to not have a test, right? There's been this whole big, it's been in the news for the past week. So yes and no in terms of the discrimination. There are going to be colleges who never go back, right? But the reason that we don't have the full answer is because what they're trying to figure out is whether or not the students that they admitted without tests are still being academically successful on those campuses. And they don't have enough data yet to be able to ascertain that, right? Because we're kind of just in year one, really. And so they want a few years of data. So for the class of 2025, that's going to be an interesting shift, I think. I think the class of 24 is still going to be mostly in a test optional world, but I'm not sure what's going to happen with the class of 25. So it'll be interesting to see. So I would say we're not even going to be talking about taking the test anytime soon, so I wouldn't even put it on her radar just yet. Like, I would wait another year, let's see what happens after next year, so after your sophomore year. Let's find out what colleges are potentially doing for the class of 24, and then revisit that entire conversation. So I don't even care that we're talking about tests right now. Like, as a freshman, I don't want you to be thinking about it, I want you to be thinking about it. But I want you to know that it's a potential to come down the pike. And again, in a test optional world, if you don't want to take it, there were colleges that were test optional before this pandemic, right? I just think more are going to remain test optional than we ever had. So if that means that's a component that we look at in terms of you applying to school because you don't want to take the test, then that's just one of those factors that we consider in building the list. So it's not necessary that you're going to be required to take it. There will always be colleges that you won't have to take it. Does that help? Okay. I'll take like 2 more questions.
My question is actually, if I have a question that doesn't apply to everyone, would you say after?
Oh, sure. Oh, yeah. I'm happy to answer individual questions at the end, too. Yeah, go ahead.
What about the volunteer hours?
Oh, very good. Do you have a specific question about it?
Like, is there something that they're still looking at, or even giving that presentation?
Yeah, okay, so overall, we are not required at Miramonte to have volunteer hours to graduate, because that's a big question, because some high schools do actually require that. We are not required to do it. Jen Mosier is actually currently in charge of our program, although I think it's gonna filter into the parent club next year, we're hoping. So, but to answer your question, so colleges like engaged students, right? They want them to be engaged members of their campuses. So how you engage may be through volunteer work, because if you volunteered in your high school, you're probably gonna do some sort of like philanthropic work in your college campus too. If that's important to that college, if that's the culture that they're trying to create, like some colleges, like Tulane, it's a really big part of what they do. Like, they integrate into the city of New Orleans in a big way. So if you're applying to Tulane, they're gonna be looking to see, like, how did you integrate and give back in your own community? Because you're probably gonna do that here as well. So it becomes a little bit of a factor. But volunteer, again, I get back to, like, if giving back is something that you really feel is important in this world, then do it, right? Don't do it for the sake of what you think colleges are gonna do. Because there's always a different number, but there's roughly like 2,300 to 3,000 4-year accredited colleges in the US. So plenty of options. When I'm telling you to only apply to no more than 12, like we can certainly find colleges that are gonna match what you're looking for. And if volunteering is part of that, then great. And if it's not, then don't do it for the sake of doing it. Do it because it really kind of draws you towards it. All right, I'll take one last question. Yeah.
So if you take an AP class, in general, in your opinion, you should always take the AP test,
Yes.
and then you submit the AP test score.
So AP tests, when you fill out an application, AP tests were not considered in the admissions process. So it will be part of the application that you fill out, but when you're being evaluated, that is not a test score that they are looking at as to whether they're gonna say you should come to my high school or come to my college or not, right? The reason students take AP tests are twofold. One, they can eventually get college credit at a lot of colleges. Depending upon where you go, you may get a full year under your belt, or you may just get like a couple of classes, it depends. But additionally, what it also shows at colleges, they like learners, like getting back to being engaged, right? Being engaged on every level. So being an engaged learner, you took an AP class and you took the test, which tells me that you're really interested in that subject matter, that you probably learned it. Is that?
Yeah, so you're saying college, even though they see the score, they're not using it as a criteria?
It's a self-reported score. So you can choose to report it or not. Even in a world where SAT and ACT were very much, where they were required, you had to submit your official test score report from those institutions. AP tests are only submitted once you deposit at a school, and then you send your official AP test, because then they go and they look at it. So they're self-reported on the application. Including like in your senior year, it will say, are you planning to take what AP test are you planning to take? Because they're gonna see your schedule, so they wanna know like what AP test you're planning to take. But it's not part of whether or not you get into that school. Yeah, it's not an admission criteria. Okay.
Do you recommend that they do report the score, or do you really think
It
it's just?
depends. It does, it really does depend. So technically it's out of 5 points, like the APs. 3, 4, and 5 were considered passing. If you have a 1 or 2, I would absolutely not report that score. I'd rather they see that you took AP bio and not see that you took the AP test. And we can, there's a whole like explanation that you can give on the applications. There's an additional information section that we can, if we need to, we can explain some of the red flags that might pop up. But for the most part, I would tell students to report those scores. If they passed, I would. Yeah, I would. Because, again, we're balancing the list, right? So like the 3 at a highly selective school, they might like glance at it for a second, but they're really not taking it into consideration. You passed. So it kind of validates your coursework here. So, okay. Thank you very much. I hope this was helpful. If anybody has questions, I'll be back.